Hey YouTube, I'm Sergeant Indy, and this is Ninjectory. Okay, so this is my final dev vlog for the Devtober event, and this is my post-mortem video. So this one's going to be a bit drier than normal, probably not going to show very much gameplay. I've got sort of a weird slideshow presentation. I'm just going to kind of go through the whole project top to bottom, outline what went well, what didn't go well, etc., and just break down what I did for the last month. I've got my own, there's a written dev vlog I've put up, or written postmortem I've put up, and I'm gonna put that up, like it down in the doobly-doo at the bottom of the video, so you guys can go read that if you want. I have it up on my second screen right now to kind of go through and, you know, give me something to talk about, etc. So some of this stuff I'm gonna say in the video, some of the stuff I'm not. It's just sort of whatever. So first up, here is a cool little, like, splash page that my buddy Kelly Robo made for me. Super talented guy. He knocked this out for me over the weekend, and I've been trying to make it so that that's the proper icon for my game on itch, etc. But I think it's just a cool title page, etc. So this is the state of the game, right, when I started. Not really when I started. At the beginning of the year, I'd kind of been toying with this idea a little bit, and I put together a prototype, and that's what this is. And then I ran into a bunch of, like, mental health problems, and you know what, I should probably talk about that in, like, a second video, and just where I've been for the last year, because it's been really bad, really rough. Doing a lot better now. The VA took very good care of me, but this is the initial prototype. I've got my mouse cursor so you guys can... So up here is 8/16, that's your move speed and your boost speed, and then 8 is your turn radius. And in this build, by hitting select and start on the controller, you could alter your turn radius and your move speed, and just so that we could test the game at different speeds. But this is more or less what I was going from. Like, I had a prototype, and the prototype was kind of fun. There were a number of problems with the prototype, etc., and so I essentially rebuilt the whole game from scratch for Devtober. Let's just move on. Next slide. So, one of the problems with the game is that the spawning system was completely random initially. So we'll go back here. Like, all of this, every time you'd play this level, you would fight a set amount of missiles, right? Like, that was sort of preordained by how the level system worked. But, like, the mix of missiles, and in this one, so, like, yeah, okay, so here we're just seeing regular missiles and micro missiles, right? The mix of missiles would be random. Where those missiles would spawn from would be random. The time between spawns would be random. So, seeing as it's sort of a score-based game, etc., it seemed like really bad design to have a system that was entirely random. So, the first thing I set about doing was trying to come up with a consistent spawn system, and that's what you're going to see here. And these are just, like I said, these are just GIFs. If you've been following me on Twitter, you've probably seen a lot of these before, but I'm giving a lot more context to them than I'm able to do in, you know, like 200 characters or whatever. So that's what this is doing, is I set about a series of DS priority lists in GameMaker. Sorry, DS priority queues. And in a single step, what I'm doing is I'm setting the seed of the game to the room name plus the wave number, and then I'm stuffing all this information into these priority queues. So, and these queues control when missiles spawn. Like, they're just like several queues, like timer, missile type, missile X, missile spawn X, missile spawn Y, missile target. But that way, every time you play a level, and here's a bit bigger one, this is, you know, a full screen, full level size, and it has several different missile types, and you can see I'm counting the missiles here. So I would go through and I would like write down like, okay, well that wave was this many missiles and these buildings were targeted so many times, etc. And just making sure it was all consistent and that my system worked. And it does. So now that every time you play, the first level, the spawns and the missiles are going to be exactly the same every time you play it. And that's just, better consistency for a score-based game. So this is me just sort of getting in there, like after I've rebuilt the spawning system. Now I'm like, okay, well, I've got a spawning system, but that's not a game. So let's get my dude flying around. And that's what I did for, these are all kind of titled too. And I've renamed them all Dev GIF, just so that they'll be in order for this little slideshow I've put together here. So some of them are pictures, not GIFs, but whatever. So yeah, this is day 3. This is me going in. You can see I'm still kind of tracking what missiles spawn per wave, etc. And I'm just going through and making the game actually playable. Day 4, I got my level select, my saving, my loading, all that stuff works. I got my score screen working. So at this point, day 4, I've already got the entirety of the old game ported over, rebuilt from scratch. And there was a number of other things that also kind of changed. Like the way I was doing my controller input was a bit goofy in the prototype. I mean, it worked, but the way I'm doing it now is definitely better. So there's more changes than just my spawning system going on here. Also, the entire world map got shorter. So, if it's shorter, then there's less time that a missile is on screen between when it hits its target, because there's less altitude it could spawn from. And that was mostly because I didn't like in the old version, it was a little easy, you had plenty of time to go to missiles, but also you get up to the top of the map and you couldn't see the buildings anymore. And so I wanted you to always be able to see the buildings, at least the bottoms of them, even when you're all the way up at the top of the screen. So on to day 5, and now I'm, another challenge that this project sort of had. I was kind of like, okay, so I've got missiles, I've got buildings, I've got this, missile command kind of ripoff that I'm making, but what do I do with it, and how much can I actually do with it? So there were a number of things I had to prove to myself were possible in order to think, is this a real game or is this just a throwaway project? And one of those things was, how many missiles could I possibly actually make? So part of this challenge for Devtober was okay, well maybe I'll try to make I already had micro missiles, regular missiles, fat missiles, the big round ones, and armored missiles. And fast missiles. So I already had 5 missiles. Can I knock out 5 more without too much trouble coming up with what a missile is, etc. And so this is the kinetic missiles. These missiles can't be chain reacted into. Instead, chain reaction explosions just make them faster. So you have to hit them with your sword. And I was like, okay, well that seems cool. That's a twist on what missiles do, etc. These are EMP missiles. I've mentioned this in a dev video and on Twitter before, but it's the Fruit Ninja sort of game design still sort of applies here, right? If you have things that you're supposed to hit with your sword, it only makes sense to have things that you can't hit with your sword. So these EMP missiles, they shut off your jetpack for a little bit. So we're on day 6 now. We're still the first week of actual Devtober. I'm still making missiles for the most part. Day 7 is when I rebuilt my controls. So before there was, and this was another sort of challenge I had with the game, is the controls were very simplistic. You just point the analog stick where you want to go. There was only 2 buttons. There was swing your sword and there was boost. And that was that. So one of the things I decided I wanted to do was just add more buttons. So I put a break in. And I widened widened the natural turn radius. So you're slower to turn around than you were in my original prototype, but if you hit the brake, you turn on a dime. So the idea is you could do these sort of breakneck turns. At this point, I hadn't really changed. Oh, it's what's with the mouse cursors? What's doing? Okay, but I'm an idiot. I recorded my mouse cursor in the GIF. Oh well. This is before I made a couple more changes to the brake system, but this is where the brake system came into play. Like day 7, I'm like, okay, let's start messing around with this sort of brake thing. Another thing the brake system does now is that when you brake, you've got like a quarter of a second after you brake, where if you hit the boost, you instantly boost rather than having to hold the boost button down a little bit. And it's just another, let you like turn and burn and like snap around real fast. I think it's really fun and enjoyable gameplay. A lot of people are having trouble getting hold of the brake, but it's the first 10 levels of the game. There's not really much need for the brake in the first 10 levels of the game. The second 10 levels of the game really reinforces the brake with some of the new missiles that I've come up with, and hopefully that'll get people using it. But it's like progression. Players aren't using the brake because they haven't really been taught about it yet, and that's fine. That's how games work. Here's the big thing that's going to get you to use your brake. So this is another new missile I came up with. This missile targets you directly. If it hits you, it shuts off your jetpack. But if you cut your engines with your brake at the last second, it instead self-destructs and explodes very violently. You can take out a bunch of stuff with it. So it's like my 3rd or 4th new missile. Again, we're on a day 7, so into the first actual week. And here I put in the jammer. So what the jammer does is and you can kind of tell at the beginning of this GIF, it puts a layer of static over the screen when it exists, and then the closer you get to it, the harsher the static is. But also, like when I kill it, you see that missile pop up on the radar. Any missile that's within like 1,000 pixels of it, which is a good chunk of screen real estate, right? I mean, they don't show up on your radar at all. And I think I might change that. I think I might change it to be if its X is within 1,000, it won't show up on screen, because then the screen's actually like 1,500 tall. But then we could just have this corridor of no radar kind of thing. Day 8. So I had a bunch of particles, but they weren't particles, right? Like, so all of these explosions that you're seeing before, and all these little puffs coming from the end of my rockets, etc., all these poofs, all of these, those are all objects in-game. And so GameMaker can handle thousands of objects. Does it super easily. What GameMaker and no other game engine really does particularly well is create objects in a single step. So when I'm trying to like make 50 explosion things in a step, I mean, you think every object, every time you type a variable in GameMaker and it pops up green, that's a default variable that all objects have. So they've all got an X, they've all got a Y, they all have a speed, direction, sprite index, image X scale, image Y scale, yada, yada, yada. So every time like that explosion happens and I'm making 50 little puffball things, right? They all have a crap ton of default variables that even if you're not using them, it still allocates memory for them. And allocating memory is just kind of inherently taxing. So what you're seeing here is me switching over to a particle system. And it has just been, so I mean, for starters, my missile trails look a lot better. You got the little sparks popping up. They look better than the default, whatever. I added some sparks to the explosions. I think that makes them look a lot cooler too. But you can make a crap ton of particles on the fly, and it doesn't really mess with your FPS nearly as much as making actual objects do. And then you can sort of split the load, because you definitely can go overboard with particles, right? You can go crazy overboard with particles, and it can cause your FPS problems. But you're sort of splitting the load between objects and particles to kind of hit a happy medium. Because I want to say particles are mostly handled by your graphics card. I could be wrong. Anyway, splitting the load's definitely the right way to do this. If you're messing around with any things like this in the future, try to learn particle systems that are worth your time. This is just a goofy thing I was doing. I was having some really bad hangs, like the game would freeze, and so I was trying to figure out, okay, what is causing this? And so I was going through, and like every object that could be created by the game, I was having the same controller that controls the spawning and the sort of general game state. I was having it draw all of this crap to the screen. The culprit was these fast missile trails, which for some reason, every now and then, they would create like an infinite amount of fast missile trails. And so ultimately it was a problem where I had inherited the parent event, which was supposed to kill the fast missile trail, and then it was supposed to kill the fast missile. Like, so if it got hit by an explosion or your sword or whatever, it uses the normal missile event to do all of that, and then it shoots off the fast missile trail to the side, kind of zip like that. And then that was it. But since the Instance Destroy was in the event inherited, for whatever reason, it was creating a crap ton of these fast missile trails. So I had to put another Instance Destroy after creating the fast missile trail, which should have been redundant, but it fixed it. And I don't know. Game Maker's just kind of weird sometimes, especially with Inheritance, which is upsetting because Inheritance is really, really strong, and you should still definitely use Inheritance. Just be mindful when you're using that some problems could arise. So now I've got first draft of my building collapse particles, explosion particles, trails. We're on day 9 now. I've almost completely ported. And every time, this is not Ninjectory, obviously. I've at this point, I've built a second thing. I've ported a bunch of stuff over just to test things out. Anytime I was going to make a major change like this, I did this. I encourage everybody to do this. Make a prototype for your particles. Make a prototype for whatever it is you're doing. If I went back, the GIF of just the ninja sort of flipping around with the brake, that's its own thing too. I just made a little room, put some buildings into it, and I fiddled with the brake and imported the code over, because that way if anything went wrong, I didn't risk my current project. It's easier to port this code, this thing, when it works. It's easier to take this and put it into my current project than it is to, and then I can troubleshoot around my project if, like problems arise or whatever, right? It's easier to do that than it is to build all of this stuff from the ground up in your project and have like something go wrong with it, because then you're like, there's just too many variables involved. There's too many what's wrong, So at this point, I consider the first draft of my particle system more or less done. It's a matter of implementing them in game. And so that's what this is. This is me. And it's actually kind of cool because this GIF, it shows off my new particle system on both the missile trails and the explosions. I don't have any shots of, like, you can see this instance max and instance count variable in the top left corner here are being drawn. Those are things that I was tracking before I did my particle system, and my instance max would get up to like 3,000 or at least 1,700. Somewhere between 1,700 and 3,000, kind of depending on whether there was micro missiles or not. Because micro missiles are inherently pretty taxing on the instance count because they were poofing little trails behind them and then they all explode and chain into each other. And it was just unsustainable. But at this point, I'm doing a bunch of big explosions, and my instance max never gets above like 70, 80, which is, you figure you got 9 buildings, you got a dude, you got your dude's trail, which is its own separate object, so it can fade out when you're doing your little brake flip. All that's important. But, and then all the missiles, obviously. So 78 is a really healthy number of instances for what this game's doing. It's all offloaded onto particles safely. Day 11, this is where this is not a very exciting GIF. That's fine. Also, it's a GIF that looks like it's kind of getting chewed up. This is just Microsoft Photos. We're going through this. So you see some artifacts here. It's not very good at GIFs, but what are you going to do? So this just says performing brief, missile. So all this was I realized that now I've got these missiles. Some of them are pretty complicated. I needed a way to relay information to the player. So this was me proving to myself that I could come up with a system that could keep track of what missiles you've already been briefed on, and if a new one has arrived that you haven't seen before, it's smart enough to do the brief. New title page I came up with. I like the zooming by buildings. It's a little busy, and this GIF kind of skips. It's not entirely seamless, but what are you going to do? That's GIFs. This is the first draft of just what a briefing system could look like, maybe. and it's just popping up some default text. So this is day 15, we're halfway through, I'm putting briefings in. This is the first actual briefing I did off of the missiles, also day 15. So it all works, and like I said, when it gets done with this briefing, it shoots you back to the room where you came from, and it just changes that Boolean variable to, yes, we've already seen this missiles brief before, don't do that again. And it won't. It saves that. So you only have to see each briefing once. This is day 17. I spent the next several days coming up with these little exploded overlays from the, you can see when it pops up the top left here. Any second now. There we go. I wanted to show, like a scan of the missile and all that. So I spent like 2 days churning these stupid things out. Oh my God, I hated every minute of it. In the process of doing this, because I'd have to make this stupid thing, right? I would start here, and then I would just sort of click and drag these parts closer and sort of delete as I went. It wasn't until the second day that I realized that GameMaker couldn't do layers. So instead, So GameMaker 1 couldn't do layers. I didn't expect GameMaker to do layers at all, and I didn't feel like booting up a sprite because I wanted to be able to just, like this is obviously a sprite I already had, and I just turned it this sort of aqua color that I'm using for my UI. Anyway, GameMaker 2 has layers, so I just made this stuff one layer, and then the missile that exploded around it and sort of shrinks down on it a second layer, and then it was much easier. It got much faster, which is good, because, gosh, this was miserable. Here's just how my brief text system works. It's actually super easy, so we'll go back here. You see, like, Barry's, John, and then what they're saying, right? So how all this is handled here, right? So missile brief position 2, that's like, so, Barry says, can you read me? Loud and clear, patching through the missile command radar. So at 2 is when we put the little brief thing that comes in the top right corner of the missile scan. For most of my briefs, it's 0. It pops up right away. But I just have the speaker name array, speaker sprite array, speaker text array, and that's it. I just fill all this stuff out for everything that I need, and it does the brief. This also works for, I use the same setup for, like, story beats. So in the first act, at the end, there's this part where DC's under attack, and you're like, oh, well, I'm gotta go save the president. No, don't save the president, save the civilians, yada yada. I just use the same system for that. And all we do is we change all of these, like up here is all of the sprites that are used for, like this thing that pops up, the little missile exploded backing thing. They've all got to have slightly different sized outlines and yada yada yada. I just change all that to no one. I change missile brief position to 999 so it never matters. But the same system, I use it for this, I use it for story beats, etc. That was another thing I needed to kind of prove to myself, like, is this a game? Can I deliver information to my players about what all these missiles do so they don't have to figure it out on their own? And, can I also do, like, story beat kind of things? So here's just a little bit of, my brief system. It's all done. This is, the little anti-ninja missile thing. Also, I just thought this was funny. Like, why do they keep trying to EMP me? Why aren't they trying to kill me? And it's like, oh, well, they're hoping the fall will kill you because you're good at dodging explosions. And it's like, well, little did they know, ninjas don't take fall damage. I don't know. I just think it's funny. So now we're on day 19. I've implemented these Sidewinder missiles. So one of the things, and I've mentioned this briefly in another video before, you have to sort of figure out what optimal play for your game is, right? Because it doesn't really matter what you've designed as a designer. Your players are going to gravitate towards what the easiest or best way to play the game is. And so I realized that optimal play is you go all the way up to the top of the screen and you wait for the missiles to spawn. And you can kind of tell how good you're doing by how low to the ground you get. The lower to the ground you're getting throughout the course of a wave, the worse off you're doing. And so I created these signed water missiles, and rather than spawning from the top, they spawn kind of somewhere between halfway and like 2/3 of the way up the screen, and they fly directly parallel, and then as you can see, they turn. They have this secondary booster that makes more sparks or whatever, and I'm not haven't quite, like, at this point, it looks really goofy. It looks better in game now, but this is, day 19, I hadn't fixed it yet. Day 20, this is me starting to work on my intro, because that was the other thing. I've got this goofy story. So I grew up, I'm old. I grew up in like the late 80s, early 90s, when everything was either big dumb action movies, ninjas, or both. And these guys have you can see them kind of clipping through the ground. It took me, oh my god, let's talk about this for just a second. I was troubleshooting this for a long time. I fiddled with these guys like jumping and landing code over and over and over again, trying to figure out, like, why do they keep clipping through the stupid ground like that when they hit the ground? There's nothing I could do about it. I was doing this thing where, like, okay, well, if you're touching the ground, we'll move you on top of the ground kind of thing. What had happened was I hadn't set that sprite's origin. So all these ninjas, their sprite's origin is bottom center. And for that one, it was still top left. And so that's what this is. I was going through my code like crazy, and it was a sprite origin problem. Anyway, so I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s. Everything was dumb action movies or ninjas or both. And so that's what this game's kind of heavily, inspired by, is like, the games that I grew up playing, and also just this general stupid action movie aesthetic kind of thing, right? So this is a game about a guy, aliens are attacking the world with missiles, the rocket scientists can't science fast enough, the ninjas can't ninja high enough. Only one man is both a rocket scientist and a ninja. It's really dumb, but I think it's funny, Anyway, all these sprites were done by Quickless, who, at Quickless on Twitter, did a bang-up job, didn't charge me too much for the sprites, so very happy with how my intro turned out, but it's okay. This should be the entire intro. We're going to talk about this. So this room is this many screens wide, and every time there's a fade wipe, we just move over one. So those scientists are always typing, these ninjas are always jumping. The president is always just sitting there, although it gets the trigger to change to slamming the fist on the table. And we just move over like, it's 6 scenes wide, and we just move every time there's a screen wipe. Easiest cutscene I have ever set up. But I was managed to set this up, and this is something that I think went really right for me. Because, Postmortem, talking about what went wrong, what went right, right? This one went really, really well for me, but I spent like 2 days planning and storyboarding this. And granted, so the weekends I'm at the shop. I'm at I own a store. I own a board game store, and I work the weekends there. I own it with a bunch of friends of mine. It's like a big worker co-op. But like weekends, I don't get to get a lot of dev time in, and so it was just a good time for me to sit down and, oh my god, I forgot to mute Gmail. Sorry about that. Anyway, so it took 2 days of me planning this out, but because I took that time to plan out how I wanted to do it, it was really easy for me to then talk to my artist and say, hey, I need these scenes from you. I'm going to make this one myself. This one's really simple and stupid, right? But like, I need the scientists typing. I just need some ninjas jumping up and down, and I'm just going to put them in my stock background. I need this president at the Oval Office slamming the thing. I need the door opening. And I need them all to be this big, yada, 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 yada. I was able to give him very precise instructions of what I needed and then put it all together. Went really, really well. Like I said, easiest cutscene I've ever made. I think it's funny. I think it looks really good. It's very on brand for the dumb action movie kind of tone of the game. And now we move on to like the last kind of week. The last thing I had to prove to myself, it's like, is this an actual game, right? Was, can I make a boss fight? And you don't need boss fights in games, I guess, but people will expect them. Gosh, mute my phone too. My wife is just killing me right now, guys. Okay, sorry about that. I told her I was recording too. Anyway, can I do a boss fight? And again, you don't need a boss fight, but I think the game would be really bland if I didn't have them. And obviously, like, boss fight, it's more of like a set piece. So this is the beginning of like a plane, and you've got to protect this plane. Its 6 engines are the target. So could I get this plane moving around in a big room? And again, when you prototype something, this is not Ninjectory. This is a second project I made just to fly this stupid plane around. And then I programmed my dude up again, which was really easy to just port over. Okay, can I fly him around with this thing? Can I get missiles coming at this thing? And once all that was done, I then just ported it back over into my main game and got it working. But this was several days worth of work to try to get this done, because talking about what went wrong, this went wrong. So what went right was this did prove to me that I can do a boss fight, right? Like, I convincingly have this thing, right? But it's not as epic or cool as I wanted it to be, right? It's just 3 waves. The missiles start coming from the top. The second wave, they come from the top and left side. And the third wave, they come from all around. But I wanted this like story beat where they'd be like, okay, get the flares going, and then flares would blow up all the missiles, but you would just be running around like crazy until that happened, trying to keep this plane in the air. And I just couldn't get it working right because I ran into issues with making the flare particles work good, and then I was running into problems with sound channels. You try to blow up like 50 missiles at once, right? And it just like blows your speakers out. That's ridiculous. Anyway. So, this shouldn't be here. Sorry about that. I was trying to come up with, this should be here. This is another thing that went wrong. So this is from a game called Afterburner 2. And what I wanted to do, you see all these clouds, right? Your plane's not going anywhere in this game. It's just moving up, down, left, right? It's not moving forward at all. But these clouds pop up on the bottom, and they give you the impression that the plane's moving forward very quickly. I wanted to have a bunch of clouds that would move backwards to give this plane the impression that it's moving towards the screen and that you're kind of moving alongside it or whatever, right? And I just couldn't figure out how to get it to look right. And granted, this is ugly the way this is done. There might not be a good way to do this. Anyway, another thing that I couldn't get right with my boss fight. So now here we are, day 28, and you can see we go from 22 to 28 is just me porting the boss fight over, wrestling with this stupid thing, trying to make the flares work, trying to make it more exciting, and I just couldn't get there with it. And so ultimately, my boss fight, like, I proved to myself that yes, you can do a boss fight, and that was important to me, and that is good. But that boss fight right now, it's barely a proof of concept of what it could be and what I want it to be. This is just me showing off. I got updated portraits of for the briefing system. Yada yada. This is me showing like I needed to come up with a method of delivering story or tutorial like in media res, like while you're playing the game, right? So this is me showing that off, and yes, it works. So now the tutorial pops up like, oh, you can press this button to swing your sword, and in this case, we're doing story beats for the president escaping on the top secret Air Force 1000 at the beginning of Act 1. Day 29, we're coming close to the end here, and again, ultimately I wanted to come up with some sort of 10-level demo. That was my goal for Devtober. And one of the things I've been dreading the entire month was like, God, how do I do mouse and keyboard controls? I can't just be like, no, play it with an Xbox controller or get out. And so I was dreading this all month, but once I actually sat down and spent another weekend at the shop kind of thinking about it, those weekends at the shop were kind of a bummer because I only had like, an hour or two on Saturday to like, oh, maybe I'll do this just to say that I worked on my game today. And that sucked. But the planning I did while I was at the shop was always invaluable to the next week. So once it came around to me actually doing the mouse and keyboard controls, and again, this is a separate prototype, build it there. If it works, port it over to the main game. But once I started messing with it, it came together really well. I still prefer an Xbox controller, and I still think that if like that's the correct way to play the game. But really, mouse and keyboard wasn't that bad at all. It works pretty well, and I'm really happy about that and how it turned out. This is this is funny. So you can see here it says disconnected, and then it says connected, right? I wanted to make sure, like, hey, what happens, right? You're playing with the gamepad, and it comes unplugged. Your cat gets at it, or maybe you're playing with, like, you start the game up and you thought your Xbox controller was connected, but it's not. You're like, oh gosh, I got to turn the stupid thing on. Can it be smart enough to switch between the two? So what you're actually seeing here is at the beginning of the GIF, I'm playing with the controller in, and I have the cord of the controller in my teeth. And then I yank the controller out of the USB port with my mouth and switch to mouse and keyboard. And then I start, eventually like, oh, look, it works. Cool. And then here you see it starts flying straight line for a long time. That's because I'm over there. I'm fumbling to plug the stupid Xbox controller right back in. Point is, it's pretty seamless to swap between the two. Really excited and happy about that. This is me using the mouse and keyboard. Like I said, I got it pointed into game. It's got this weird kind of narwhal effect right now where the line's always drawing straight from your head. I think I'm going to, fix it so it draws like a length away from you pointed at the thing rather than directly from your head. It just looks goofy. Also got the menu working. So now, because that was the problem with the menu, is the menu originally was just a DS list of options and then an arrow that would be drawn based on, it's a DS list full of options. So like it was like, new game or continue, and then like flight test, boss test, exit, and there was also a variable for list position that couldn't go over or under, like under 0 or over whatever, but it would just increment up and down. So I was like, okay, well, that's not going to work because those aren't objects. They didn't exist. You couldn't click on them. So I had to change them to a DS list of objects instead. But now it works for both clicking on them or selecting them with the controller. And again, the game works fine with the mouse and keyboard in-game. Oh gosh, this is private. I forgot to take this out. So what this is I made credits for the game because like there's a demo. More than just me worked on it, and I had a bunch of people I wanted to thank anyway. So I figured I would make a credits page for the end rather than just my default end for a prototype. When you get to the end of a prototype, is I just put the text from Metroid, like the NES Metroid, at the end because I don't know. It reminds me of my childhood, and I think it's a funny reference to make. Anyway, Kale was a really good guy on Twitter, and he was really supportive. Great guy. And he got banned for saying something about TERFs. Like, I'm trying not to swear on my channel, but he was like, I don't like TERFs in a strong way. And it was during that era where Twitter would ban you because TERF is a slur, but Twitter's not doing anything about Nazis or whatever. Anyway, so Kale got banned for a week and then decided to stay banned. But before that, he'd made a joke about how you're like, oh, what are these things you want to see in a game? And I want to see my name in the credits. So I just made this GIF to show Bums, who's a mutual friend of me and Kale, so that Bums could show Kale, because when Kale was unbanned, he decided, maybe screw Twitter. Maybe I don't want to mess with Twitter anymore. At any rate, that's done. Apparently, this is the last slide, and it was the slide that, again, like I said, you guys should be able to see. So, what do we got here? let's talk about I'm just scrolling through my thing real quick. So what went right was, more missiles. If we go into here, we go into missiles. There's a lot of them now, right? I mean, no, there's not, because this is not the correct build. Oh, that's okay. Originally, what I was going to do was I was just going to go through a bunch of different builds and show you the builds, but I didn't have a build old enough that just had the spawning system, so I said, screw it, I'm going to make a slideshow presentation instead. But I've got like 10, 11 missiles now, and I've got like 3 more on paper that I haven't just, actually put into game yet. So, yeah, I think, knocking out 10 missiles easy and being able to still come up with more, I've proved to myself that the game can have varied enough gameplay to be cool, right? And I think that the anti-ninja counter missiles, the air-to-ninja missile, the jammer, the EMP missile, I think that those change up gameplay enough that, you mix and match these, if I come up with like 15 missiles, you mix and match them, you'll have a very varied set of gameplay from beginning to end. Let's see, I managed to deliver story and information. I built a boss fight. So what went wrong was the boss fight is, again, it's barely a proof of concept at this stage. It's kind of ugly. I'm still waiting on sprites for it. I didn't get the flare thing done, but whatever. But I proved that I can do it. And so it needs work, sure, but I'm willing to do that work, and I'm willing to try to make more boss fights for the game, and I think that that's success, even though the boss fight's current incarnation is bad. Another thing that went wrong is music. I'm a solo dev. I am not a musician. I'm not a sound guy. And so I almost never code music. So I got a bunch of free music from somebody pointed me to, like, hey, check this guy out. All the stuff's for free. And I found a couple of tracks that I really liked, and I tried to put music into the demo, but I just couldn't code it. And it's partially because I was trying to do this persistent object that would sort of like crossfade between tracks or whatever. Anyway, it was just a mess. So music didn't make it into the demo, and that's a bummer. Another thing that went wrong was Twitter engagement. So for me, I know I can work on a game for 30 days straight. I've done it with a lot of projects. I've done it with Frog Sword. I've got a bunch of my own little projects I've worked. Working on a game for 30 days straight is not hard for me. What is hard for me is that, like, since Frog Sword, right? Like, in the wake of Frog Sword, I got blamed for it falling apart, and as a result of this, I got harassed a lot, and so, like, just in the wake of it, it burnt all of the connections that I had made making Frog Sword, and like, I was getting like harassed on like Twitter and a little bit on TigSource too, and so like, it's been like 5 years since then, and I've ever since then I have been terrified to share my projects with the public, right? Like, you're watching this, in fact, right now, you're watching this on a channel that has like 3 or 4 secret dev vlogs on it. They're hidden, and I only share them with my friends who also make games. Because I'm terrified to put myself out there, because, what happened at the end of Frog Sword was really toxic, and it hurt me. And so, one of my goals this month wasn't just about, can I work on a game for 30 days? Can I engage with Twitter and put myself out there for 30 days? And that was really hard. And it started out great. I mean, if we go back through there and you could see the dates of all those GIFs, right? And like the first 2 weeks, I'm posting like sometimes 2 GIFs a day, and it was wonderful. Around the halfway mark, when I started having to do the briefing sprites, and I was having to, starting to work on the boss and stuff, the GIFs dropped off significantly. And it was kind of a bummer, because I felt like, even when I was showing the boss GIFs, I was like, okay, so you got this big stupid plane that flies around the room. Who cares? That's not as exciting as like the bouncing around and hitting things with your sword and explosions. Like, I thought the early GIFs were a lot more exciting than the late GIFs. And that's just a bummer, but you know, what are you going to do? It's fine. It's fine, really. Last thing that I did wrong, and this one's kind of a doozy, but it's not in my proper devlog. So I didn't make one copy of Ninjectory. There's not one demo. I made a second demo. Because like I said, there's a bunch of secret devlogs on my YouTube that I only share with, like, developer buddies, right? Well, I made a secret demo that had, like, not just the 1 to 10 level progression, it also had the all missiles mode that had, like, all of the different kinds of missiles that I have, all 10 or 11 of them. And I gave that out only to dev buddies, right? Well, there's a problem with that, right? Because I gave it out to my family, I gave it out to my friends, I gave it out to my dev buddies. So in the end, that's a whole lot of views and downloads that aren't happening on my itch page, right? Because I just gave it to people. And it feels kind of dumb to be like, hey, I made this game. I want you to try it. Please go to my itch and download it. Like, yeah, that feels weird as opposed to, here's a Dropbox link with the build just for you. It's got special stuff in it. You know, I mean, that felt like the right thing to do at a time. But as a result, like, the discoverability and the views, like the views affect the algorithm that affects discoverability. So, like, all I've done by handing this out for free and not saying, hey, please go to my itch, is I've hurt my game's chances of being found on itch. So, that's bad, right? Anyway, that's the last thing that really went wrong. What went right is pretty much everything else. It was really easy for me to come up with 5 more missiles. That was super easy. I could probably come up with easily 5 more, maybe a dozen more. I like the new controls. I like the brake and stuff. A lot of new players aren't really, like, getting the brake. Like, why would I use the brake? But I'm hoping the levels 11 to 20 will kind of get them into the brake. Like I said, the intro is awesome. Quicklist did some really great work for me, and my prior planning there, 6 Ps, prior planning prevents piss poor performance, and my prior planning of that, building that thing, made it super easy to put together. The briefing system is not only solid, but versatile, because I can also use it for, like, story beats, and it would be really easy for me to change backgrounds, or maybe change how that room's laid out, depending on what briefing it is. It's really versatile and easy to put together. So, at any rate, overall, I would say, yeah, Ninjectory has been a success. I'm happy with how Devtober worked out. I'm calling it a win. As to where I go from here, well, there's probably going to be another version of the demo coming soon, where there will at least be new sprites for the Air Force 1000, because I've got a friend working on those now. It's Quicklist. It's the same guy who did my intro. And the briefing sprites. Hopefully by then I will have worked out and made it a bit more climactic. And so hopefully by the end of November, I will have, Demo 2.0 done. And I will be moving on towards finishing the game, which is going to be somewhere between 30 and 40 levels, 2 to 3 more boss fights, and a bunch more story stuff. And again, the story is just goofy, over-the-top 90s action movie dumbness, which I love. But that's where I go from here. Anyway, that's Ninjectory. There's going to be a link down below. You can go click if you want to go play Ninjectory. It'll take you to my itch page. Please do. Please give the itch page traffic. I really shot myself on the foot. I've got to make up for lost time here. Please please go there. Please download it. And if you like it, please leave a rating. If you don't like it, please don't leave a rating. Anyway, that's Ninjectory. This is what I'm working on right now. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you next time.